So last time we were here, the Russians had withdrawn from the war. So let's look and see a little bit. And this is very brief and is not very in detail. If you were in class, we did go into detail on this, but we do not actually have time in the video to do that. So we know that the Bolsheviks, who later become known as communists, take over. It's called the Bolshevik Revolution, or the Russian Revolution. It's a very simple summary of it. So there are four causes that you are supposed to know for the Russian Revolution. First one we've already talked about during imperialism. The Russians lose the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905, which the black eye makes Russia in general, and particularly Tsar Nicholas, look bad. At the same time, it appears that Russia is sort of becoming weak, and just like in France, we have a huge number of landless peasants. That means they don't own any land. It's about 85% of the people in Russia are super poor, don't own any land. And then we have a series of events where Tsar Nicholas just does not do a good job as a leader, including people show up with legitimate complaints in the capital, and the soldiers fire on these people who are not necessarily doing anything wrong. They're just trying to raise a complaint about things that were real. But the thing that pushes everything over the top is World War I. The Russians have the highest casualty rate in World War I. Part of it is due to the fact that their soldiers were poorly trained and didn't train with equipment. A lot of these soldiers who get injured or die haven't held a gun until they actually get to the battlefield because they did not have enough weapons to practice with. So they have a huge number of soldiers, but they don't have weapons for the soldiers. So in a lot of cases, they are showing up to a battle with no weapon and are expected to pick up a dead person's weapon and fight. So that leads to Russian Revolution because most of the soldiers are working class people, and it's really easy to get somebody behind a socialist idea if the working class people are literally being sent to be slaughtered in the war. So what we have is the first country in the world based on Karl Marx's ideas. So we have the Bolsheviks. They are socialists. They become known as the Communist Party. So from today forward, we will call these people communist, even though we all know they're actually socialist. The one specific thing you're supposed to know that they did during this time period is, so Lenin was actually, he's a very likable leader if you look back on him. And he was a good leader, a capable leader. But the farms were not doing well. They tried to use communist principles, and it wasn't producing enough food. So he actually is going to come up with something called the New Economic Policy. And what he does is he takes capitalist ideas, he gives incentives to the farmers to grow more food, and it works. For a while, it works, and it increases the amount of food grown, and it helps Russia, the Russian economy, grow again. Now, eventually Lenin's going to die. He had, before he died, he actually said he did not want Joseph Stalin to take over control of the party. But as soon as he's dead, Joseph Stalin does take over, and they're very different leaders. And Joseph Stalin is going to be one of the most important people in the 20th century, and we'll talk about him more after the war is over. That's when he really starts influencing the rest of the world. He's the leader who takes over the Soviet Union after Vladimir Lenin dies. Alright, so the next thing we need to cover is, we already have sort of alluded to this, but one of the causes of the war is imperialism, but it also is a resource. So the places with the bigger colonies have more people to fight for them. Best example of this is in India, where we got over 1 million people show up to fight. And like I've mentioned earlier, India and Ireland have a very similar relationship to England and the United Kingdom. And so India sends a ton of soldiers. Ireland also sends a ton of soldiers. And they are hoping, in most cases, these colonies are hoping, by fighting in the war, they will show that they're loyal, and then when the war is over, if they ask for independence, it will not look like they're ungrateful, and they feel like they were more likely to get it. In almost every case, it doesn't happen, especially for the British colonies. Alright, so let's take a minute and we'll look at how World War I was different from wars that came before it. The big thing that makes it different is the Industrial Revolution. It makes for this like super brutal war. Submarines, which are a result of the Industrial Revolution, are also brutal. Ships cannot see them coming. They have no idea where they are. They don't have technology to really track them. And so they're able to just hide, and when a ship comes, sink them at will, basically, for a long time. This is a German weapon. The others don't really have anything to fight it. And then the third thing that makes the war really brutal is trench warfare. So you have machine guns, which make trenches necessary. And so we have this system of trenches, and in order to get guys out of these trenches, you have to physically send soldiers through what's called no man's land. It could be up to half a mile wide, and the guys just have to get out of their trench and run across this big open land with guys shooting machine guns at them and try and get the people out of these trenches. It's really, really, really brutal, and tons of people die. A lot of people don't even make it out of the trench. As soon as they stick their head and torso above this line here, they get shot. In some cases, we see 1 million people dying in a battle. Or sorry, casualties, not deaths. Now, once the Americans joined the war, having the fresh bodies actually is going to be more than the Central Powers can handle. And so once the Americans show up, almost immediately, what we see is the Allies start winning. The other thing we bring with us is the Spanish flu, which ends up killing tons of people, and it weakens all these guys who've been in the battlefield for years. But you're generally just supposed to know about disease in general. So, it leads to Armistice Day, which was November 11th. And that is a ceasefire. Later it will end up being a peace treaty, which we will look at. So the Treaty of Versailles. So the 11th, November 11th, is going to be Armistice Day. Today in the United States we call it Veterans Day. But, a lot of Europe still calls it Armistice Day. So at the Treaty of Versailles, these guys are collected. The thought is they sort of do a redo of Congress of Vienna. And they probably had the people to do it, but World War I is the worst war the world had ever seen. We had 8.5 million people die. We had 20 million people who were either wounded or maimed. By the time the war ended, we had 32 Allied powers. So at the treaty, we've got the big four. We've got the U.S., it says Britain, it should say the United Kingdom, France and Italy were present, but not invited. Two big powerful countries, Germany and Russia. Russia wasn't invited because they quit before the war ended. They are going to be super bitter about that because they lost more people than the other countries. At the treaty, France and the UK are going to gang up on Germany, and they're going to force this through. Germany has to accept all the blame, and they have to pay reparations, so that's money. They have to pay all the damages from the war. So the continent of Europe has been totally destroyed, and the Germans have to accept all the blame and say they will pay to repair everything. Woodrow Wilson from the United States is not in favor of this, but goes through anyway. Now, Woodrow Wilson's big thing was something called the League of Nations. The hope was it would prevent future wars and give everybody a place where the countries of the world could get together and work out problems through talking instead of fighting. Now, the U.S. doesn't approve it, so the U.S. never joins. So that's a weakness. Another weakness is League of Nations doesn't have an army to enforce their decisions. So that's always going to be a weakness of it. So there are the big points of the treaty. Self-determination for the nations, form the League of Nations, freedom of the seas, so you can't stop ships anymore. The British Navy and the German Navy were doing this, and the creation of something called the mandate system. The French and the UK were jealous of each other. They wanted to make sure they each got the same amount of land, and so they create something called the mandate system, which we will look at more closely in a classroom activity. But, and then you don't need to memorize this, but you do need to understand that Woodrow Wilson had something called the 14 points that he includes in the treaty, and this is what it included. Now, the big effect is, at the end of this war, there are no multinational empires, so Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire lose their empires. So the different nation groups are going to get independence at the end of this, and we will look at a map that shows exactly how that happens. But this is a big thing. At the end of the war, you've got all these little countries. Before the war, if you remember, everything was a big country. Now we've got a whole bunch of countries, and they are smaller. One of the things that was a really bad outcome is the mandate system. The French and then, the British Empire want these lands. They're technically there, being overseen by these two countries until they get a government set up. The idea is once they are established, they can become independent. But they're treated like colonies. So we've got Iraq, Transjordan, which today is Jordan, and Palestine, which today is Palestine and Israel, are going to be ruled by the UK, and then Syria and Lebanon will be ruled by France. And these boundaries are poorly drawn. It's just like what they did in Africa. The people who live in here are from different nations. It's the opposite of what they've just done in Europe, and it's going to lead to fighting. And so today, the conflicts that start here are still going on 100 years later. A lot of it stems back purely to the way World War I ended. So, that's all the big stuff. We are going to have some activities that look more specifically into these things. You need to make sure your packet is totally completed. There's some maps and other charts and things you need to make sure you've interpreted and completed. If you have any questions, I know that this was a really quick breeze through the end of the war, but if you have any questions, please make sure you let me know.